said it before, and I'll say it again. Your priest is not normal. I have another example for the list. Seminary. The normal way to have a career as a priest in the Episcopal Church is to go to college and then go off to seminary for 3 years. Not me. Oh, I went to college and then I went off to seminary, all right. But it took me 9 years to get through a 3-year seminary degree. Now, there are reasons for my abnormality. I dropped out of my first seminary and eventually dropped out of my former conservative religious tradition. I changed denominations. I found the Episcopal Church. But then there was a bigger reason. My wife and I had a baby. And then we had another one. Now, I managed to finish seminary without any student debt, which is kind of unusual. I did it with my wife's help and by taking 9 years and by combining a full-time job with half-time schedule at seminary or a half-time job with a full-time load at seminary. It was a lot of work. But I learned something more important than what they were teaching in the seminary classes. This is the important lesson that my wife and I learned. We'll get through this. Hard as it was, and as long as it took, by God's grace, we got through it. We'll get through this. And you know, for 26 years now, as a priest, I have watched people in the churches I've served, and I have seen the same thing. I have watched parents coping with the stormy, sometimes even dangerous journeys their kids go through during adolescence. And it reminds me of whitewater rafting. You know, first you're in the rapids, and then eventually, if you hang on, you end up in the calmer waters. I've watched people care for elderly, fragile parents, coping with difficult demands. Sometimes patiently, sometimes not, but always with love. I have heard stories from people who got through a war, or who lived through the Great Depression, or suffered terrible losses that came far too early in life. I've watched people care for a family member who has a profound developmental disability. And by watching the people in the churches I've served, I have relearned that seminary lesson. We'll get through this. Now, the past few weeks we've been hearing from the letter to the Hebrews. This New Testament document is kind of strange to our ears because it uses a style of biblical interpretation from the Hebrew Scriptures that is very, very strange to us. But the overall message of Hebrews is all about endurance. We'll get through this, the writer says. And then today we hear words of Jesus from Mark's Gospel about hard times that are coming. Times of persecution and violence and destruction and natural disasters. Now, literal-minded Christians have done great mischief with this passage and other passages like it. I think it's crazy to try to predict the future using biblical texts. Instead, Jesus is giving us an overall message to hang on to. And the message is, we'll get through this. There is hope. The book of Hebrews says it. Jesus says it. And I have seen it again and again. Endurance. Hang in there. We'll get through this. And I think that word "we" is really important. We get strength from our God, and we also get strength from our companions. Now, you know, if I were a superhero, and I know this is unlikely, I don't really look that great in spandex, but if I were a superhero, I would not want to be the Lone Ranger. Instead, I would want to be on a team of superheroes like the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, or the Justice League of America. I think life is about community and companionship and being part of a group of like-minded people. I mean, think about it. Even the Lone Ranger was not alone. He had his buddy Tonto with him. Joining hands can help get us through hard times. Now, do you remember that, I'm sure you do, that terrible day, September 11, 2001, Now, at our house, we get our news through the radio because we don't have TV. But either that day or the next day, I was down visiting somebody from St. Mark's in the hospital, and I found a waiting room that had a television on. And I watched a press conference being held by the mayor of New York City and the governor of New York. And you remember how raw our emotions were that day. Well, I remember the governor saying something important. He said something that touched me. He looked right into the cameras and he said, "We'll get through this." And tears came to my eyes. That was a word I wanted and needed to hear from my leaders on that day. We'll get through this. We'll hang in there together. We will help one another. We will show our endurance. And as people of faith, we can say that in the face of death itself. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, end with resurrection. The Gospels say that Jesus got through death itself, and so will we. Your priest may not be normal. Your priest took an extra long time to get through seminary, but it did teach him something. And you have taught him something. We'll get through this. Hang in there. We'll get through this. By the grace of God, by the promises of the Gospels, by the strength of our own companions, we will get through.